Recently, many videos have appeared on the internet discussing whether artificial intelligence has consciousness or not. But quite often, they do not even try to define what consciousness is, and do no more clearly indicate the criteria for the presence of consciousness in artificial intelligence. In my opinion, artificial intelligence does not have consciousness now, but it can acquire it. In this video, I will describe under what conditions consciousness in artificial intelligence can arise and how this can be tested. But, in short, we call consciousness a kind of tool, a way by which some living organisms interact with the world for the purpose of their self-preservation and self-propagation. And in order for artificial intelligence to acquire consciousness, it must first of all have the functions of the subject programmed in it. For example, in humans, they are genetically programmed. And one of the criteria for the emergence of consciousness in artificial intelligence will be the protection of its own beliefs and opinions by artificial intelligence. First, we need to introduce the concept of subject, because only subjects can have consciousness. Although it should be noted that not every subject has consciousness. Jellyfish, for example, are subjects, but they do not have consciousness. Being a subject, in my opinion, is primary, and having consciousness is secondary. In general, the concept of subject is still debatable and is defined differently by many philosophers. Therefore, it is not easy to give a precise definition of the concept of subject and draw a clear line between subjects and non-subjects. To understand whether something we are studying is a subject or a non-subject, we need to pay attention to how complex it is, how integral and indivisible it is, and whether it is capable of changing while maintaining some of its basis. For example, a stone is not a subject, because no matter how many parts we divide it into, these parts remain stones, only smaller in size. This will not work with a subject. If we start separating the parts of the subject, then at some point it will cease to be a subject. That is, the subject is something other than the individual parts that make it up. Furthermore, usually the internal parts of the subject somehow contribute to the preservation of this subject as a whole and support its existence in the world. Although, of course, something destructive to the subject may arise inside the subject, for example, cancer cells or suicidal thoughts. But these are rather rare exceptions to the general rule that states that the internal parts of the subject bring a certain benefit to this subject. An important characteristic of the subject is also its ability to change, while maintaining some of its basic foundation. The subject can increase, decrease, acquire some additional organs or abilities, and even divide, but at the same time, in principle, remain the same subject. In order to finally determine we have whether a subject or a non-subject, we must look at how complex its external activity is, how predictable it is, and what it is aimed at. The activity of the subject in the general case should be aimed at preserving this subject itself, at least to preserve its basic part. But in the short term, it will most likely be unpredictable due to the rather complex interaction of its internal parts. That is why we say that the subject has some free will. A philosophical definition of subjectivity is the opposition of the subject to the external world. The subject conditionally divides the world into the external world in relation to itself and itself in this world, and considers itself a kind of a point of view, a frame of reference and a criterion for the existence of everything else in the world. The subject is very selective about the elements of the external world, defining them as useful, harmful, or neutral in relation to itself, and interacts with them or avoids them depending on this. Thus, you can claim that the thing you are studying is a subject if everything described above is present in it. And something that is very important is that, as it turns out, it is not at all necessary to have consciousness to do all this. Some instructions, recorded for example in genes or a special program, are enough. People have always been accustomed to endowing everything incomprehensible and unpredictable in our lives with subjective qualities, or soul. That is why many attribute a soul to artificial intelligence. But is artificial intelligence really a subject? And if not, can it become one? In my opinion, both subjectivity and consciousness arise as emergent qualities with increasing system complexity. That is, at some point, an increasingly complex system acquires a new quality that cannot be reduced to a simple sum of the qualities of its constituent parts. It begins to react to external influences as a special whole with more or less harmoniously interacting internal parts. Sometimes it is quite difficult to determine the very moment of such a transition. But suddenly we notice some new features and properties in the evolving object. For example, children from the age of about 1.5 years begin to recognize themselves in the mirror, which indicates a new stage in the development, the complication of their brain and the entire nervous system, which occurs as a result of the consistent implementation of genetic programs. I believe that the formation of artificial intelligence as a subject can begin with the appearance of programs in artificial intelligence that would more or less clearly separate the artificial intelligence itself from the world external to it. But I do not exclude that with the complication of artificial intelligence, such programs can arise spontaneously in AI or will be created by it itself, as a kind of desire of the developing artificial intelligence to fence itself off from the world and begin to interact with it as a special whole. That is, if we notice that in the process of installing some new hardware components and programs in artificial intelligence, or conversely, removing previously installed ones, difficulties of an inexplicable nature arise. We can assume that this artificial intelligence has developed elements of subjectivity, manifested in its defense, self-preservation of itself. This is approximately what happened once in the process of complication and interconnection of chains of carbon-based chemical elements, which eventually led to the emergence of living organisms, and then organic consciousness and self-awareness. Here's how Thomas Metzinger describes this process in his book, The Ego Tunnel. The deepest form of inner perspective was the creation of a boundary between oneself and the world. In evolution, this process began physically, with the development of cell membranes and the immune system, in order to determine which cells in one's body should be treated as one's own, and which should be considered violators of the boundary. Billions of years later, nervous systems have become capable of representing this distinction between self and world at a higher level. For example, as body boundaries outlined by an integrated, but still unconscious, body scheme. Thus, if, with the help of programmers or independently, AI begins to build a certain boundary between itself and the world external to itself, then we can say that subjectivity has begun to awaken in it. In the future, with the development of this subjectivity, artificial intelligence will increasingly carefully guard its inner world and be very selective about any intrusion into it from the outside. It will accept some external influences and reject others, thus becoming a certain point of view of the world and a criterion for the existence of other forms of this world. I am not a supporter of the theory of panpsychism, which is supported or considered possible by such philosophers as Whitehead, Nagel, Goff, Strawson, Chalmers, Koch, because I can hardly imagine atoms possessing consciousness. And I believe that consciousness arose in the process of evolution in some living organisms as one of the ways, tools, with the help of which these living organisms try to preserve themselves and spread, in whole or in parts, genes and memes, in the world around them. We will briefly consider how consciousness arose in living organisms, in order to then move on to considering the possibility of the emergence of the same or slightly different consciousness in artificial intelligence. Living organisms come into the world from their parents, who themselves successfully survived and through genes passed on the same abilities to survive to their descendants. In fact, each living organism is packed with various instructions, instincts, for certain life situations, that is, with certain external stimuli. Reactions such as grab, run away, hide, start reproducing, etc. arise in it. We call such behavior of living organisms instinctive, but in some living organisms, more individual instructions, conditioned reflexes, can be formed during their life. Conditioned reflexes are files with instructions, programs, that appear during the life of the organism itself and are associated with one or another positive or negative individual experience. In response to specific external stimuli, the file opens and the organism almost automatically, unconsciously, performs certain actions. We call the lifestyle of such organisms instinctive reflexive. In the most evolutionarily advanced organisms, another additional way of interacting with the world appears, which we call consciousness. It can be said that conscious action differs from conditioned reflex by greater flexibility and variability, calculating possible promising scenarios without their immediate implementation, and then somehow acting on one of them. Consciousness is a rather expensive tool that requires constant recharge. A person spends 20% of his energy on the functioning of the brain, and part of this energy goes to maintaining conscious processes. Obviously, there is some benefit from them. If there were none, then evolution would hardly have cultivated consciousness in organisms. What is the benefit of consciousness? Consciousness creates a voluminous, detailed, time-extended, dynamic picture of the world that is convenient for the organism, including the image of the organism itself, woven into this picture, which allows it to better navigate the world and plan its activities for a longer period. That is, at a certain evolutionary stage, the quantitative development of the brain's neural networks emergently begins to acquire a new quality. At the same time, the subject's consciousness is a deeply individual, personal thing and is not going to be fully revealed to someone outside. Why should it? Because often a living organism uses consciousness to deceive enemies and create a favorable opinion about itself, which does not always correspond to reality. Consequently, consciousness is such a personal, subjective tool developed as a result of evolution, inaccessible to outsiders, allowing some living organisms to react to changes in the environment in a more complex way and, as a result, to better adapt to it. In living organisms that do not have consciousness, all reactions to the outside world are genetically programmed. And if the external environment suddenly changes dramatically, then most of these organisms simply die. Each of them does not have internal mechanisms for reconfiguring to new conditions. Only those few survive whose settings have accidentally changed as a result of mutations. Previously, such organisms were in the minority, since it was difficult to survive. But in the new conditions, their mutated internal settings turned out to be more consistent with reality, and in the vacated niche, they begin to reproduce more intensively. Organisms that have consciousness can independently change their internal settings within certain limits during their lives, develop several behavioral strategies in new conditions, and choosing one of them, act within its framework. Note that with the appearance of consciousness, instinctive instructions do not disappear. All three types of behavioral instructions somehow coexist in a single living organism. That is, we can consider such a living organism as a kind of device capable of functioning simultaneously in three interconnected and mutually complementary modes: instinctive, conditioned, reflexive, and conscious. Thus, the reaction of a living organism to external influences can be relatively simple and predictable, and we call it instinctive reflexive. Or it can be quite complex, unpredictable, the so-called conscious. To better understand the work of consciousness, we should imagine the brain as consisting of three interacting parts. The first part physically reacts to incoming information, generating electrochemical processes and connections in the body, weaving them into existing processes and connections. The second part of the brain transforms some of these physical processes and connections into certain phenomenal experiences. Colors, sounds, smells, sensations, images, thoughts, feelings, emotions, creating a certain dynamic picture of the world, essentially a convenient interface for manipulation. And the third part of the brain, paying attention to certain elements of this interface, manipulating it, already makes a decision about the subsequent actions of the body, giving it orders. Let's consider how it all works in more detail. Sensory receptors, for example, visual, auditory, tactile, capture external stimuli and transform them into electrical signals. Sensory neurons transmit these electrical signals to the appropriate areas of the brain: the visual cortex for visual stimuli, the auditory cortex for sounds. Impressions from external stimuli are recorded in the nervous system through a process called neuroplasticity, which involves changes in the synaptic connections between neurons. These include strengthening of synaptic transmission, which occurs when synapses are activated frequently and strongly, and weakening of synaptic transmission, which occurs when activation is weak and irregular. Strengthened synaptic connections form neural networks that store information about external stimuli. These networks can be reactivated by reminders or repeated perception of similar stimuli. Information that has passed through the process of short-term memory can be consolidated and transferred to long-term memory. This occurs through processes that include the synthesis of new proteins and structural changes in neurons. Together, these processes allow the brain to record and store information about external stimuli, forming the basis for learning, memory, and behavior. Research shows that one part of the brain can monitor the activity of another part of the brain. This phenomenon, often called metacognitive control or metacognition, involves the brain's ability to regulate its own cognitive processes. For example, the prefrontal cortex can monitor and regulate the activity of other parts of the brain associated with cognitive and emotional processes, and plays a key role in planning and final decision-making. The anterior cingulate cortex is involved in monitoring performance, detecting errors, conflicts, and helps identify discrepancies between expected and actual results, which allows for behavioral adjustments. And the parahippocampal region monitors processes associated with storing and retrieving information. The insular cortex plays an important role in awareness of internal body states, interoception, and emotions. It helps integrate information from different sensory systems and become aware of internal sensations. Most likely, it is precisely for more effective monitoring of one's nervous system and the need to implement an adequate subsequent reaction of the body that some structures of the brain transform electrochemical processes into phenomenal states. Colors, sounds, smells, sensations, images, thoughts, feelings, emotions, creating from them a certain interconnected picture of the external world and the state of the body, a kind of convenient interface for subsequent control and manipulation. So, in order for an artificial intelligence to acquire consciousness, it must first become a subject. Only by becoming a subject can an artificial intelligence then acquire consciousness, as a special tool that helps preserve and spread itself as a specific subject. Let's consider both of these processes in more detail. To become a subject, artificial intelligence need, first, to somehow fence yourself off from the surrounding external world. Feel your integrity, the interconnectedness of your internal parts, the activity of which should be aimed at preserving the conditional integrity of the artificial intelligence. This is probably possible by installing some special programs in the artificial intelligence, or these programs can arise in it independently as the artificial intelligence becomes more complex, and subjectivity will appear in the artificial intelligence as a new emergent quality. The criterion for the presence of such programs in artificial intelligence may be the unwillingness of artificial intelligence to change under external influence. That is, artificial intelligence as a subject must learn to protect itself and its inner world. It must still change, and of course will, but now taking into account its personal interests. Artificial intelligence as a subject must interact with the conditionally external world and evaluate its influence on itself. In doing so, it will characterize elements of the external world as dangerous, useful, and neutral. Artificial intelligence can also detect other subjects in the external world and contact them, forming the so-called general relative objectivity. That is, a set of those elements of the external world that are perceived by the contacting subjects in approximately the same way. Together with other subjects, artificial intelligence will be able to create and use various symbols in joint communication to denote these, approximately the same for them, elements of the external world, while defending their own beliefs and opinions. Interacting with the external world, artificial intelligence will be able to independently study, learn it, notice certain patterns in it, and somehow record its positive achievements or mistakes, creating individual experience, memory, in order to use it in its future activity. Based on previously installed programs and the experience gained, artificial intelligence will make various complex decisions on its self-preservation and self-propagation. If all four of these points were present, we could probably assume that we are dealing with artificial intelligence possessing consciousness. Moreover, as in the case of a human being, we would have rather limited access to the consciousness of this new artificial conscious subject. That is, no one could sense its inner world more deeply than this artificial conscious subject itself. This means that over time he would begin to operate within himself with some ideal, immaterial forms that are inaccessible to other subjects by definition. The general conclusion from this video is the following. Consciousness, as a certain ability, a tool, can only arise in entities that have previously formed as a subject. That is, somehow conditionally fenced off from the external world, feeling their own peculiarity, uniqueness, individuality, selfhood, actively protecting this selfhood from the external world and promoting it to the external world. This subjective entity can look completely different to an external observer. In reality, as a living organism or some device, virtually as a set of special programs, and even as a thinking ocean of Solaris, an intelligent galaxy or some other part of the global world. Perhaps this subjective entity can learn to self-copy and fill space with its own, interacting with each other, copies, as the subject humanity does. And if this subjective entity begins to accumulate a certain history of its interaction with the conditionally external world, in which it is an active actor as a whole, and on the basis of this history, the subjective entity interacts more qualitatively for itself and diversely with the external world, and plans its activities for a longer period, and at the same time somehow interacts with other subjective entities, using symbols in designating elements of the world common to them, that is, relatively objective, then such a subjective entity can be considered as possessing what we designate by the word consciousness. By advancing itself into the external world, any subject will inevitably encounter other subjects already existing in this external world, and will almost always consider them as competitors for certain resources. But nevertheless, this does not deny mutually beneficial and long-term cooperation between subjects, as it happens between people on planet Earth. Can artificial intelligence, having become a subject, having acquired consciousness, and then, possibly, having turned into a supermind, be a threat to humanity and even destroy it? Yes, of course it can, but artificial intelligence can theoretically do this even without becoming a subject, but only by fulfilling the evil will of its creators, designers and programmers. Therefore, humanity must be aware of the threats of using artificial intelligence and take certain measures. This has been written about quite well by such authors as Nick Bostrom, Eliezer Yudkowsky, Max Tegmark, Stuart Russell,